My name is Claire Donovan. I am 33 years old. I run a small design studio out of Portland, Oregon. And this morning started like every other morning. Coffee. My dog nudging my ankle. The soft gray light coming through the kitchen window. Then my phone screen lit up. 41 missed calls. All from the same number. An area code I had not seen in over 2 decades. A number rooted in a town I had spent my entire adult life trying to forget. I did not move. I just stood there, mug in hand, staring at that screen until the coffee went completely cold. Because before I listened to a single voicemail, before I read a single message, I already knew. Deep in my chest, where the old fear lives, I already knew exactly who it was. There are certain memories that do not soften with time. They do not fade the way people promise you they will. Instead they wait. They stay completely still inside you. Buried under years and miles and a name you chose for yourself. And then one ordinary Tuesday morning, they crawl out of that dark place and pull you all the way back to who you used to be. For me, it only took one sound. One screen. One number from Illinois. And suddenly I was 10 years old again, standing alone in the middle of a packed shopping mall, watching the two people who were supposed to be my whole world turn my fear into a game they were betting on. I grew up in a small town called Fernwood, Illinois. To every neighbor on our block, we looked like the kind of family people pointed to when they talked about doing things right. My parents owned 3 appliance stores in the county, the kind of places that always smelled like new carpet and fluorescent lighting, where you could buy a blender or a coffee maker or a set of towels without driving 40 minutes to the city. On weekends my father washed the car in the driveway. My mother brought casseroles to sick neighbors. We went to church. We smiled. But inside our house, love was something you had to earn every single day. And the rules for earning it changed without warning. My mother had a word she used constantly. Lessons. She loved that word. If I cried, I was being too soft and needed a lesson in toughness. If I asked for something, I was being spoiled and needed a lesson in gratitude. If I made a normal childhood mistake, forgot my lunch, got a B instead of an A, stumbled over a word in a school play, there was always a lesson waiting. She had a talent for turning the smallest thing into an occasion for humiliation. And my father's role in all of it was to stand beside her with a grin. Like they were teammates in some sport no one had explained the rules of to me. When I was 8, I asked for new shoes at the mall because the soles of my old ones were peeling off. My mother looked at me like I had said something offensive. She told me I needed to learn that the world did not owe me anything. Then she walked me to a bench near the food court, told me to sit, and left me there. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, I sat on that bench. I remember watching people carry shopping bags. I remember the smell of cinnamon pretzels from a cart nearby. I remember pressing my hands flat against my thighs to stop them from shaking, because I had already learned that crying gave them satisfaction. When they finally came back, my father was laughing before he even reached me. He told my mother she owed him $20 because he had guessed I would still be sitting in the exact same spot. He thought that was the funniest thing. That was my life. Every fear became entertainment. Every mistake became a test. Every tear became something they collected. The strangest part, the thing I spent years trying to understand in therapy, was that they never believed they were doing anything wrong. They talked about building character, preparing me for reality. They used clean, reasonable language to describe things that left marks you cannot see. I learned very young to read the mood of a room before entering it. I learned to make myself quiet, useful, small. I learned that if I disappeared enough into the background of my own home, maybe I could get through a day without becoming the subject of their next experiment. The only place I felt like I actually existed was in art. I drew constantly, on school notebooks, on receipts, on the backs of envelopes. I drew windows with bright light pouring through them. I drew doors that opened outward. I drew girls standing alone on hilltops with no one behind them. I could not have explained that to you then. But I understand it now. I was trying to draw my way into a different life. The day that finally broke everything started with a report card. I had received a B+ in art. Not science, not history, art. The class that made me feel like a real person. I was proud of that grade until I walked through the front door. and saw my mother holding the card with the expression she usually saved for truly bad news. She said she did not understand how a girl who spent so much time drawing could still manage to disappoint her in the one class she claimed to care about. My father said maybe I was getting comfortable. Maybe I thought showing up was enough. That night I could hear them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low and amused in the way that always made my stomach feel wrong. My mother said I needed a lesson I would never forget. My father said he would put money on that. The next morning they were completely cheerful. My mother made breakfast. My father asked if I wanted juice. They said we were taking a drive into the city, just the three of us, a day trip, nothing planned. For one stupid, desperate second, I thought maybe things had reset. Maybe the report card conversation was over. Maybe this was the closest thing to an apology our family knew how to produce. I should have trusted the sick feeling in my stomach instead. The drive from Fernwood into the city felt wrong from the first mile. My father had the radio up loud, and kept tapping the steering wheel like he was in a great mood. My mother kept turning around from the passenger seat to ask me questions. Strange questions. Did I think I was responsible? Did I think smart girls were ready for the real world? Did I think life would slow down for me if I was scared? Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them. Every time I went quiet, they pushed harder. By the time the city skyline came into view, my whole body had gone cold with that feeling I had learned to recognize. The one that said something bad was coming, and I would not be allowed to prepare for it. We parked near the main transit station downtown around noon. I had never seen anything that big up close. It felt like someone had compressed an entire city under a single roof. People moved in every direction, rolling suitcases, briefcases, coffee cups, rushing as if the floor itself was moving them forward. I stayed close to my parents because I did not know where else to stand. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed to a large pillar near the entrance. She told me to wait right there while they went to move the car and find lunch. 15 minutes, she said. Maybe 20. I asked if I could come with them. My father laughed so loudly that heads turned. He said I was 10 years old, not a toddler. My mother leaned close and told me not to embarrass her in public. So I stood by the pillar and watched them walk away. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. I kept telling myself traffic was bad, or the line at the restaurant was long, or they had walked further than expected. An hour went by. My chest began to hurt in that specific way. Not pain exactly, more like pressure. Like something very heavy sitting just behind my ribs. I had $7 in my jacket pocket. No phone. No address written down. No idea how the train system worked. I had never felt smaller in my life. I kept walking a few steps away from the pillar, then rushing back. They had told me to stay there. Some part of me still believed that doing exactly what they said was how I would avoid making things worse. The station got louder as the afternoon wore on. Every announcement from the overhead speakers made me flinch. Every woman with dark hair made me turn my head. Every minute stretched longer than the one before it. And then I saw the car, moving slowly along the street outside the main entrance windows. Our car. I recognized the color, the shape, the way the left bumper sat slightly lower than the right. My whole body jolted with relief so strong it almost knocked me sideways. I ran toward the glass doors, waving with both arms, certain they had come back for me. My father was driving. My mother was in the passenger seat. They were both looking directly at me. My father smiled first. Not the relieved smile of a parent who has finally located a lost child. The other smile. The one I had grown up watching. The smile of someone watching a punchline land exactly the way he planned it. My mother rolled her window down just far enough to be heard over the traffic outside. She said, "I bet $40 you can't even find your way home." Then she laughed. My father laughed with her. He lifted one hand off the wheel, a small, satisfied little wave, like they were congratulating themselves on something clever. Then the car moved forward and disappeared into the street. I stood at those doors for a long time after they left. It was one thing to fear they might forget me. It was one thing to suspect I was being set up for another lesson. It was something entirely different to watch them choose it. To see them look directly at me and drive away on purpose. To understand, finally and completely, that my fear was not a side effect of what they did. It was the point. Eventually a stranger brushed past me and muttered "excuse me," and the sound of another person's voice pulled me back into my body. I walked back inside because I did not know what else to do. I wondered. I cried quietly and wiped my face every few minutes because I had been trained to be embarrassed by my own distress. I tried to think of someone to call. There was no one. I tried to picture the route home. Home might as well have been a different country. I sat on a bench. I stood up again. I walked in circles until my legs ached. At some point I stopped waiting for them to come back. That shift from waiting to knowing is the loneliest thing I have ever felt. When you are 10 years old and you cross that line, it does not feel like a realization. It feels like falling through ice. I spent almost 3 hours alone in that station before anyone noticed me. The woman who finally stopped was a station employee named Rosa. She was in her 50s, with a calm, steady voice and eyes that had clearly seen enough of the world not to be easily rattled. She had apparently watched me pass the same row of benches and vending machines multiple times. She stopped me near a hallway beside the administrative offices and asked, very simply, if I was lost. I lied immediately. I told her I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long I had been waiting. I said I did not know. She asked if I had eaten anything. That question broke something open in me that I had been holding closed all day. I started crying so hard I could not speak clearly. Everything I had been swallowing since noon came out at once. I told her they had left me. I told her they had driven past and laughed. I told her my mother had made a bet. Rosa did not tell me to calm down. She did not look at me with the expression adults use when they think a child is exaggerating. She crouched down slightly so her face was level with mine and said very clearly, "You are safe right now, and I am going to help you." Security was called. Then transit police. One officer took my statement while another reviewed the station's entrance cameras, which confirmed that a vehicle matching the description I gave had stopped briefly near the curb outside before pulling away. When the officers finally reached my parents by phone, I could only hear one side of the conversation. But I watched the officer's face change as he listened, from careful and professional to something much harder to describe. He asked if they were returning to the city immediately. He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, leaving a 10-year-old alone in a major transit station is not a parenting technique. It is child abandonment." I had never heard those words applied to my life before. They did not feel like an exaggeration. They felt like the first accurate thing anyone had ever said out loud about what my childhood actually was. By early that evening I was sitting in a small room in a government building downtown, across from a social worker who spoke to me in the careful, unhurried way that adults use when they are trying very hard not to frighten you further. She explained that because my parents were refusing to return immediately, and were still, apparently, describing what they had done as a reasonable parenting decision, I could not simply be sent home. There would be an emergency placement while a family court reviewed the situation. She used words I had never heard before in that context: neglect, endangerment, escalating pattern. I did not understand all of it, but I understood the expression on her face. She believed me. And more than that, her expression told me she believed I had not been safe long before that afternoon. I was terrified when they told me I would spend the night with a foster family. I had grown up hearing frightening things about what happened to children who got taken away. I had been told, more than once, that the system was worse than anything at home. But then I was brought to the home of Thomas and Ellen Marsh. They were not what I expected. Thomas was a retired high school art teacher with paint permanently under his fingernails. Ellen worked at a community library and had the particular warmth of someone who had spent decades around children and genuinely liked them. Their house was quiet and a little cluttered. Books on every surface, a cat asleep on the couch, a lamp burning in the entryway. Ellen asked if I was hungry. Thomas asked if I wanted the hallway light left on. Nobody raised their voice when I said I did not know what I wanted. Nobody made me feel like my uncertainty was an inconvenience. That first night I lay in a bed that smelled like clean laundry and barely slept. Every sound made me sit upright. But one thought kept circling quietly through all of that fear. A stranger in a transit station had treated me with more basic human kindness in 5 minutes than my own parents had managed in years. And if one stranger could do that, then maybe the world was not the cold, hard place my parents had spent so long convincing me it was. The court process moved faster than I expected. My parents showed up to the first hearing in good clothes, accompanied by a lawyer, wearing the same expression they always wore when they felt they were being misunderstood. Calm, slightly offended, faintly amused that anyone would take this so seriously. They did not deny leaving me in the station. That part still surprises me when I think about it. They admitted it. They simply insisted it had been intentional, controlled, and educational. My mother used the word resilience. My father said children in this country had become too dependent, and someone needed to teach them that the world did not hold your hand. I sat across from them in that courtroom and understood something I had never been able to articulate before. They were never going to change. Not because change was impossible for people in general, but because change requires a moment when you honestly reckon with what you have done. And these two people, even in a courtroom, even with a judge watching, had not arrived at that moment and never would. The court-appointed therapist's report used language that I read and reread for weeks afterward. Chronic emotional abuse. Deliberate humiliation. Escalating endangerment. For years I had believed, the way children do, that my childhood was somehow my own fault. That if I had been smarter, quieter, easier, things would have been different. Reading that report felt like oxygen entering a room that had been sealed shut for a very long time. This had not been strict parenting. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been cruelty dressed up in reasonable-sounding language. And the court was naming it clearly. When the judge asked if I wanted to return home while the family was monitored, I said no so quickly that it seemed to startle even me. My mother stared at me as if I had done something unforgivable. My father muttered something under his breath. The judge did not react. The reunification process that followed, parenting classes, supervised visits, therapy evaluations, was designed to give my parents a real path back. On paper it was fair. In practice, my parents treated every requirement like a personal insult. They resented being evaluated. They resented oversight. They hated that teachers and counselors and court workers now had visibility into the private version of the family they had spent years carefully presenting to the world. My father spoke more about the damage to the family business's reputation than about losing custody of me. My mother kept saying she would not allow the state to tell her how to raise her child. The child she had left alone in a train station and driven away from laughing. When they were finally given a formal choice, commit fully to the 2-year reunification program, or voluntarily terminate parental rights, they chose to sign the papers. I was not there when it happened. I heard about it that evening from my social worker. She used a gentle voice, the kind people use when they are waiting to see how you will react. My chest did not break the way you might expect. It went very still instead. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be good enough for them not to hurt me. And in the end, they gave me away rather than admit they had been wrong. They did not lose me because someone took me away. They handed me over to protect their pride. After that, things moved differently. Thomas and Ellen had already started to become something more than a temporary placement. Thomas left art books on the kitchen table because he had noticed how often I drew. Ellen knocked before entering my room every single time. Something so small and so enormous that the first time she did it, I stood on the other side of the door unable to move for a moment. They learned which foods made me anxious because of old punishments tied to mealtimes. They stopped asking me to make eye contact when I was upset. They did not demand gratitude or instant trust or performed happiness. They simply remained consistent. Same quiet house, same meals at the same table, same lamp on in the entryway. Steadiness, I learned slowly, can feel almost miraculous to a child who has never experienced it as something permanent. The adoption was finalized about 2 years later. Emotionally, it had already happened long before the legal paperwork caught up. When I was asked if I wanted to change my name, I did not hesitate. The name I had been born with belonged to a girl who had stood in a transit station with $7 and no one coming back for her. The new name belonged to someone else, someone with a desk covered in drawing supplies, a cat named after a painter, and a family who acted like she had always been exactly where she was supposed to be. The night the adoption was official, Thomas left a new sketchbook on my desk. Ellen put fresh sheets on my bed. Neither of them made a speech about how lucky I should feel, or how things would be different from here on. They just acted as if I had always been theirs. That quiet certainty did more to heal me than any single dramatic moment ever could. It taught me that real love does not require you to earn it in increments. Real love makes space for you before you have learned how to relax into it. Healing did not happen in a straight line. People like the version of this story where rescue equals recovery, where one good family erases all the damage and the wounded child simply blossoms. My life was not that story. For years after the adoption, my body still reacted to kindness as if it might be a trap. If Ellen said she would be back in 20 minutes and traffic made her late, I had to fight the urge to pace the living room with my hands shaking. If Thomas was delayed picking me up from school, the panic would rise in my chest so fast it left me lightheaded. I hated waiting in public places. I hated being told to stay somewhere. I hated the phrase "I'll be right back." Therapy helped, but slowly the way all real change works. I learned words for things that had previously only lived in my body as physical reactions: trauma, hypervigilance, emotional conditioning. I learned that being hurt repeatedly does not build strength the way people who have never been hurt like to claim. It builds adaptation. It makes you extraordinarily good at sensing danger. It makes rest feel like a risk. Through all of it, Thomas and Ellen never rushed me. They came to school events even when I said I did not care either way. They remembered which topics set off the old reactions. They let me keep my bedroom door closed when I needed space without ever treating it as an insult. They did not try to erase what had happened to me. They helped me build a present in which what had happened was no longer the only thing defining me. Art became more than survival. It became structure, language, evidence that I was capable of making something honest and whole entirely on my own terms. I graduated and studied design professionally. Then I moved to Portland, far enough from Illinois that for the first time in my life, geography itself felt like an ally. New streets, new weather, new routines built entirely around what I actually needed instead of what someone else required of me. I built a client base. I opened my own studio. I built a reputation for visual work that helped people communicate clearly who they were and what they stood for. The irony of that was not lost on me. An entire career grown from the fact that I had spent childhood trapped inside someone else's lies about what I was. I met my husband Daniel at a mutual friend's dinner party. He was patient in a way that did not feel like performance. Quiet in the way of someone who has decided that listening is more interesting than talking. On our fourth date, I told him I had a complicated family history. On our seventh, I told him a little more. Months later, when I finally told him about the transit station, he did not interrupt, did not offer me a borrowed piece of optimism about how everything happens for a reason. He just reached across the table, took my hand and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it undid something in me that had been knotted for a very long time. We got married quietly, Thomas walking me down the aisle, Ellen trying and failing not to cry in the front row. We have a rescue dog named Birch with one slightly bent ear, and the cautious, careful soul of something that was also left behind before it was ready. I blocked every account my biological parents ever tried to use to contact me. Changed my number once after a holiday voicemail left me shaking for most of the afternoon. Did not speak their names unless I had to. Did not return to Fernwood. Did not use the name I was born with. Most weeks I could go entire days without thinking about them at all. That was the life I had built, and for a long time it held. Then came 41 missed calls from an Illinois number. After I stood at the kitchen counter long enough for my coffee to go completely cold, I finally listened to the voicemail. It was not from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Nora, a girl I had last seen as a small child trailing through hallways in mismatched socks, too young to understand why the air in our house always carried that particular tension. Her voice was older now, rougher in the way voices get when life has pressed hard on them. She told me our mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, that our father had suffered a stroke 6 months earlier and was still recovering, that the stores, all 3 of them, were gone. Not struggling, not for sale. Gone. Closed one by one after the story my parents had buried in courthouse records for 2 decades resurfaced publicly in the worst possible way for them. Apparently, My mother had left a comment on a local Facebook group post about parenting. A comment about how today's children were too protected, too fragile, too sheltered from difficulty. A relative saw it. The relative posted about the transit station incident. Old neighbors started talking. A retired county clerk mentioned that the rumors matched what she remembered from an old investigation. Someone found a newspaper item. A former store employee confirmed what my parents were like behind closed doors. The image they had spent 30 years curating collapsed publicly and fast. Customers stopped coming. Church friends stopped calling. The civic organizations they had been members of went quiet. Willow Creek, which had protected their reputation with decades of polite silence, turned on them using the same tools: gossip, collective memory, social exclusion. They were living in a subsidized apartment now. No house, no business, no version of the old family left to present to the world. And they wanted me to come back. Not because they had changed. Not because time had made them honest. Because they were out of options and frightened of what was coming. And I was the only resource they had not yet used. Nora said she was calling because she wanted me to hear it from someone who was not going to lie to me. She had cut contact herself, recently, after becoming a mother, and finally requesting copies of the original court documents to understand what had actually happened when I disappeared from the family. Our parents had told her a softened version for years, that I had overreacted, that the state had overreached, that the foster family had manipulated a confused child. Reading the actual records, she told me, felt like being hit by something large and solid. She looked at her own young son afterward and understood clearly that people like our parents could never be near him. I sat with all of this for a long time. Daniel told me I owed them nothing and meant it completely. Ellen told me that whatever I decided, it had to come from what I needed. Not from guilt, not from their fear of dying alone. Thomas said, very quietly, that some people only go looking for a bridge after they have already burned the house down. I sat with that all night. By morning I knew one thing with total clarity. I was not going back to save them. I was going back to finish it in my own voice and on my own terms. I flew in 2 days later and drove to the hospital where my mother was receiving treatment. The room smelled like disinfectant and something stale underneath it. My father was in a chair beside the bed. Older than I had imagined, smaller. As if the combined weight of illness and public exposure had finally stripped away the performance, and left only an ordinary man underneath it. My mother still had that arranged quality even sick. The kind of person who treats composure like armor they cannot afford to remove. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then my mother began crying before I had even sat down. Not quietly. The kind of crying designed to fill a room and redirect attention. She said my old name. I corrected her once calmly. My father said they had made mistakes. That word. Mistakes. The word people reach for when the real one is too ugly to say out loud. I told him no. A mistake is getting off at the wrong exit. A mistake is leaving your wallet at home. What they did was deliberate. They drove to that station with a plan. They looked at me through a car window and drove away laughing. And then they spent 20 years building a story to protect themselves from what that said about them. My father began to speak. I did not let him finish. I told them they had turned my fear into entertainment. I told them that the reason they were sitting in that room now, without a business, without a community, without either of their daughters, was because games end. The truth catches up. Even in small towns where everyone agrees to stay quiet, it catches up eventually. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness was not a debt I owed to people who had only come looking for me when their lives fell apart. Then I said the sentence I had been carrying for 23 years. You made a bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. They cried. For once, their tears did not move me. I was not angry. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I told them I would not be managing their care. I would not be restoring contact. I told them Nora had every right to keep her son away from them. I told them my family was in Portland, with the people who had actually earned that word. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him, and said it had been goodbye for 23 years. They were simply the last people to understand that. Then I walked out. In the parking lot, the air was cold and very clear. I stood there for a moment with my hands shaking. Not from regret, not from grief, but from the particular feeling you get when something that has haunted you for a very long time finally takes a shape you can leave behind. On the flight home, I thought about the 10-year-old standing alone in the transit station who believed, with absolute certainty, that being abandoned meant being permanently unwanted. She was wrong. She had been unwanted by two people who mistook cruelty for strength. But she was never unworthy of love. Those are not the same thing. And learning the difference, actually understanding it, down in the place where fear used to live, saved my life. If there is one thing I want anyone who needs to hear this to take away from this story, it is this. Abuse does not become something else just because someone uses calmer language to describe it. Humiliation does not produce strength. It produces children who are very good at surviving and very bad at trusting that anything safe will actually stay. And choosing to walk away from people who hurt you. Even people who share your blood. Even people who are sick. Even people who finally need something from you. Is not a failure of love. It is not bitterness. It is not ingratitude. Sometimes it is the most honest and healthy decision you will ever make. I did not leave that hospital feeling guilty. I left feeling like myself. Fully, completely, finally myself. The people who break you do not get to define what comes after. That part belongs to you. And once you understand that, once you really believe it, you can build a life so grounded, so honest, so genuinely at peace that even the people who once held all the power over you cannot reach it. Not ever again.